Happy World Constitution Day 2021, a celebration of written constitutions in the world, past, present, and future. My name is Richard Albert, and I'm Professor of World Constitutions and Director of Constitutional Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm grateful to Jim Shearer for inviting me to participate in these festivities for World Constitution Day. I'm grateful to Jim also for creating World Constitution Day. He conceived the idea, he created the day, and he has brought together people all around the globe on this day to mark the importance of the written Constitution. So Jim, thank you for your vision and for your innovation in bringing life to World Constitution Day. Being able to participate in World Constitution Day is a great joy for me, an honor really. And it's for me yet another reminder of why I love my job. It's a job I get to do here on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin, which is located on the indigenous lands of the Tonkawa. Their stewardship of these grounds has given me the gift of living a life of learning and discovery. And so I honor the Tonkawa, and I ask you to join me in doing the same. Come back with me to the year 1789. The United States Constitution had just become official, and the new republic had high hopes for itself and for the world. One of the authors of the Constitution was Benjamin Franklin. He had serious doubts about whether the Constitution would endure. He wrote to a friend in France to give an update on the new Constitution. Here's what Franklin wrote to his friend. Our new Constitution is now established, and it has an appearance that promises permanency. But in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. That was Ben Franklin writing to a friend in France. Now today, more than 2 centuries later, we know that Franklin had little reason to worry, because we can now speak of death, taxes, and the U.S. Constitution as the 3 certainties of life. Because the U.S. Constitution has defied all expectations about constitutional endurance. The average lifespan of a constitution in the world is only 19 years, much younger than the age of the U.S. Constitution. And today, the U.S. Constitution continues to grow older with no real risk of its replacement anytime soon. The endurance of the U.S. Constitution is just a small part of the larger story of constitutionalism that history will tell about our time. Because constitutionalism is everywhere. It informs how states behave in the international order, how governments treat their constituents, how communities order themselves, how groups relate to individuals, and how persons interact with each other. We see constitutionalism in global and regional governance, for example, the United Nations and the European Union. We see constitutionalism in arts and education, for instance, at the Louvre or any university in the world. And we see constitutionalism in sports, whether the Olympics, the Super Bowl, or the World Cup. Constitutionalism is everywhere. Because you see, all of these examples trace a common lineage. The UN has the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The European Union has a body of constitutional treaties. FIFA has a rule book. Corporations have charters. And universities have honor codes. What unites each of these is their shared ancestral bond in the written Constitution. Now, constitutionalism can, of course, exist without a written constitution. But in our day, in our time, right now, we treat a written text of higher law as synonymous with constitutionalism. Written texts and the tradition of writtenness, these are central to our understanding of constitutionalism today. Across the ages, humanity has developed a profound reverence for texts, for the primacy of written rules. From the very beginning, from the early legal codes of Mesopotamia to the Solonian Constitution, and from the tradition of the Hebrew Bible to the Quran, and from the great Magna Carta to the constitutions written just last year. Written rules rule. And we can understand why. The written form is accessible, it's tangible. It invites the reader to take hold of the text as her own and to engage with it in ways that inspire confidence and reassurance that rules will be applied as written, precisely because they are written. This makes codified rules more meaningful, more compelling than even the grandest and most magical ideas and spoken promises. These written constitutional rules that appear in constitutional texts, they build a concept of nationhood. They foster a sense of belonging. They forge a shared identity. And they orient people toward a common purpose, toward a collective mission. In his classic study of American government, Thomas Paine described written constitutions as political Bibles, as the glue that brought together disparate persons across vast lands to form a nation of persons united under higher law. All of this makes the written constitution seem like the greatest advancement in modern liberal democracy, the crowning achievement for a modern state, and the very foundation for the rule of law in the countries of the world. But what if I told you that the written constitution is not the reason why constitutionalism has taken root in the world? What if I told you that the written constitution is not the greatest achievement in modern democratic self-governance? And what if I told you that a truly written constitution, a fully written constitution, is an impossibility? That's the subject of our time today. The impossibility of a written constitution. Now take a moment to imagine your ideal constitution. What would it say in its text? It would probably celebrate democratic rights and liberties. It would promise equality and non-discrimination. It would guarantee free speech, permit free assembly, promise that you have the right to come and go in and out of the country as you choose. Your ideal constitution would also recognize probably the right to education, the right to health care, the right to a clean environment, and the right to peace and safety. It would also probably give you the right to elect your representatives and to be elected yourself. This ideal constitution would, of course, also protect the free press and your right to religious freedom. It might also declare in its text that its fundamental purpose is first and above all to ensure the well-being of its people. Now, this sounds like a modern, liberal, democratic constitution of an enlightened state. And you might be thinking right now that, yes, this sounds like a marvelous constitution. I'd like to live in that country. Well, welcome to North Korea, because that is what is written in the Constitution of North Korea, one of the world's most repressive, vicious, and undemocratic regimes. All of those rights and many more appear in the higher law of North Korea in its written constitution. Constitutions do not always tell the truth. The problem, you see, goes back to 1789 at the creation of the U.S. Constitution. The success of the United States under its written constitution gave rise to a strong association between constitutions and democracy. By the early 19th century, written constitutions became synonymous with democracy and with constitutionalism. They became interchangeable terms, and that was the beginning of the problem. The problem is that this association between written constitutions and constitutionalism presented an opportunity for authoritarian leaders. They would write down liberal democratic promises in their constitution, even if they had no intention of honoring those promises. But why, you might ask? Why? Why write a constitution and put into it promises that you do not intend to keep? Well, the answer is clear. It's to exploit the positive identification that existed then and still today between a written constitution and the values of constitutionalism, namely democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. Authoritarian leaders conceal their true intentions behind a strategically drafted constitution that appears by its words to embrace the values of constitutionalism, but that in reality is only a facade. These constitutions are no more than a smokescreen. And so in many parts of the world today, we find a legal and political culture of written constitutions without the liberal democratic culture of constitutionalism. This problem extends well beyond authoritarian states. In every single country of the world, there is a gulf between the written constitution and the actual lived constitution, what we can call the real constitution. No regime successfully fulfills all of its written constitutional commitments. No country delivers on all of the promises its constitution makes. But it's not always because of bad intentions. Let me give you a few examples. There are different archetypes of bills of rights in the world. One in particular is an aspirational Bill of Rights. This type of Bill of Rights codifies constitutional rights in its text, the same ones that you might wish for yourself. The right to expression, to religious freedom, to equality, all the ones that we might associate with liberal democracy. But aspirational bills of rights do not satisfy themselves with simple statements of citizen rights and freedoms. They endeavor to do more. An aspirational Bill of Rights speaks broadly, boldly, in ambitious language. It rejects the existing limitations of contemporary society as it is, and instead reaches far into the future to envision society as it could be. So these aspirational bills of rights, you see, they seek to transform society. They make a commitment to delivering social and economic rights to the people. For instance, the right to housing, to food, a job, the right to a minimum wage, to paid holiday and vacation, to free education. Rights that are intended to give every person a meaningful life of safety, stability, fulfillment, and affirmation as a whole person. We see these kinds of aspirational constitutions all around the world, in Poland, in Uzbekistan, Belarus, many countries of Eastern Europe, but other parts of the world too. They paint a portrait of what is possible. What is possible for a good life, for a just society, for a constitution committed to the people that it serves. But these aspirational bills of rights and constitutions often are a list of unrealistic promises that cannot be fulfilled. Some countries with these aspirational bills of rights just don't have the necessary public funds to deliver on the promises they make. And so if An aspirational Bill of Rights codifies and promises the right to a healthy environment. But the state does not have the funds to clean the environment. That right to a healthy environment might as well not be written into the Constitution because it is toothless. Consider the Constitution of Bolivia. Article 16 promises the right to food. This is an admirable objective to ensure that all persons in the country have proper nutrition. But according to the United Nations, 20% of Bolivians are undernourished. So what you see here is a disjunction between what the Constitution says and how the people live. Or consider the Constitution of Mexico. Article 123 declares that equal wages shall be paid for equal work, regardless of sex or nationality. But today in Mexico, the gender wage gap is 19%. The same phenomenon exists with environmental rights. When Ecuador inserted the rights of nature into its 2008 constitution, Ecuador ranked 22 in the world on its environmental health. Pretty good. But by the year 2020, Ecuador had dropped to number 56 in the world. So the message is clear. Beware the cult of constitutional codification. Constitutional promises mean nothing without political action. Constitutions alone cannot guarantee rights. Political actors must build political will. They must have the fiscal discipline to deliver on the promises their constitution makes. Because when a constitution says something but means another, there are real costs involved. There's a real risk to an aspirational Bill of Rights. It risks evaporating from the constitutional text all of its substantive force, and with it, the hope for cultivating a people that abides by and respects the rule of law. Because if a constitution promises the right to shelter, to food, and to a job, and if people walk down the street and see homeless persons asking for money to eat or for help for themselves and for their children, if they have no prospects for employment despite their best efforts, if people are starving to death in the country, then those who have read the Constitution and that witness these disastrous social conditions, those people will come to no other conclusion but that the Constitution does not mean what it says. These constitutions are facades. And this gulf between what the Constitution says and how it's lived, this gulf can have consequences that are quite severe for the rule of law in that country, for social cohesion in that country, and for the prospect of building a culture of constitutionalism. Those people will lose faith in the Constitution, in the institutions of the state, and they will doubt the power of government to improve their lives in the way the Constitution has promised. The people will see the Constitution as little more than just a piece of paper. This mismatch between the constitutional text and constitutional reality is not limited to aspirational bills of rights that promise social and economic rights. This mismatch is evident for all rights, civil rights and political rights and human rights too. Most of us, I think, believe that it's a good idea to codify rights into the Constitution, that it's a good idea to put more rights into the Constitution, because the more rights, the better. The better for our lives, the better for our democratic values, the better for our country. But that view is not correct. You may be surprised to learn that codifying rights in a constitution may not have much of an effect at all. You may be surprised to learn that writing down more rights into a constitution does not correlate with a better democracy. having more rights in the Constitution does not necessarily lead to living a better life. Let me explain. If you examine all of the world's constitutions and you count the number of rights in each of them, you can generate a list of the top 10 constitutions according to the rights they codify in their text. Number 1 in the world is Ecuador. Its constitution protects 99 rights. Number 10 in the world is Brazil. Its constitution protects 79 rights. Who else is in the top 10? Mexico, Angola, Venezuela, Serbia, Armenia, Bolivia, Cape Verde, and Portugal. Those are the top 10 in the world for total rights in the Constitution. But none of those countries for the top 10 in terms of rights, none of them ranks in the top 10 for most democratic countries in the world. Let me repeat that. No country in the top 10 for constitutional rights ranks in the top 10 for the quality of democracy. This is surprising for some, because one could reasonably expect a correlation between rights and democracy, but there is no correlation, let alone a causation between more constitutional rights and better democracy, a better quality of life. And the point here is that a constitution is not self-enforcing. If you want to protect rights, you must do more than simply write them down in the Constitution. Protecting rights requires political will, strong institutions, and respect for the rule of law. Let me surprise you with another fact. If you build a list of the world's top 10 worst violators of human rights, you will see that they codify more constitutional rights than some of the world's leading liberal democracies that do protect rights. The world's worst violators of human rights are the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, South Sudan, Somalia, North Korea, the Central African Republic, Chad, and Equatorial Guinea. Each of these human rights violators has a constitution, and each of these constitutions promises more rights than so many of the world's leading liberal democracies, including Australia, France, Denmark, and the Netherlands. So the point by now is clear. You can't believe everything you read in a constitution. It's not uncommon for authoritarian regimes to conceal their evil aims behind a constitution that appears to be democratic, but that in reality is only a facade. So far, we've been discussing the limits of written constitutions. I've been showing you that the idea of a truly and fully written constitution is really an impossibility, because no constitution is ever fully written. And often what constitutions say in their text does not reflect the lived reality of the people who live under that constitution. There's another reason why a written constitution is an impossibility, because sometimes written constitutions change in ways that are not reflected in the text. In other words, the authoritative legal meaning of the Constitution changes, but the words remain the same. Even the model of a master text written Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, even that Constitution is not an exhaustive list of its own rules and rights. Much of what we know and understand as the Constitution of the United States exists outside of the four corners of its text. Just as an example, in the U.S., the Contract Clause expressly prohibits states from impairing the obligation of contracts. But today it's lawful for states to intervene into contracts with good reason. The U.S. Supreme Court approved this practice during the Great Depression as an emergency measure, but since then states have continued to act in direct conflict with the text of the Contract Clause in the Constitution. This is an example of a contradiction between a written rule and an accepted practice. The practice contradicts the written Constitution, and yet the practice is accepted as constitutional. This brings us to the inescapable reality of modern constitutionalism, which is that constitutions are never fully written, not only because rules of law sometimes exist outside of the written Constitution, but also because sometimes the rules of law contradict the rules that are written in the constitutional text itself. There's another area of constitutional law that shows us why constitutions are not fully written, because they cannot be fully written, because in the end, a written constitution is an impossibility. Now, no part of any constitution is more important than the rules we use to change it, to amend it. Amendment rules tell us who can amend the Constitution, when they can amend it, how they must amend it, and whether anything in the Constitution is unamendable, meaning that it cannot lawfully be amended. For example, the French Constitution makes republicanism and the territorial integrity of the state unamendable. Brazil makes federalism unamendable. Germany makes human dignity unamendable. Indonesia makes unitarianism unamendable. The point here is that some constitutions state expressly in their text that this or that is unamendable, but not the Indian Constitution. In India, the Constitution is clear when it says that the national legislature has plenary power to amend the Constitution. There are some exceptions in terms of who can collaborate with the national legislature to amend the Constitution, but the point is that there are no prohibitions written in the text of the Indian Constitution about what is amendable. Anything is amendable because everything is amendable. That's what the written Constitution tells us. But this is just another example where the written Constitution does not reflect the real Constitution, because the Indian Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution to mean something very different from what the text says. The text says there are no limits on what can be amended, yet the court has rejected this purely textual reading of the Constitution because the court has said that the Constitution must always retain its basic structure. This basic structure of the Constitution, says the court, cannot be amended. Now, this raises a puzzle because the Constitution itself does not identify what forms part of this basic structure of the Indian Constitution. It is the court that tells us what constitutes the basic structure. And the court has used this idea to say that some constitutional amendments are unconstitutional because they violate this basic structure of the Constitution. This is an unwritten limit on the power of amendment in India, a power the Constitution tells us is unlimited. And so this is another difference between the text as written and the text as lived. This problem is evident in many other countries of the world. Now, of course, all constitutions must be interpreted and then enforced. Constitutions are not self-executing, so if you have a constitutional rule that says everyone is equal, the interpreter must tell you what that equality means in specific contexts. Because constitutions do not enumerate a resolution for every conceivable conflict that might arise under this principle of equality. No. Constitutions declare principles like equality, and we assume a further step of interpretation and application is needed. But that's different, you see, from what we've been talking about so far. We've been discussing cases where the constitutional text is ineffective in achieving its purpose, its written purpose. We've been discussing cases where the text of the Constitution has been interpreted to mean the very opposite of what it says. And we've been discussing cases where the interpreter of the Constitution has defied the meaning of the constitutional text. These are serious problems for a constitutional democracy that is rooted in the written Constitution. And yet these problems are ubiquitous in the world. no matter the country, no matter the region, they appear everywhere. And they appear everywhere because a written constitution is an impossibility. So where does this leave us? I think with many questions. Has the written constitution lived up to its promise? Has it delivered the public goods we imagined that it would? Has it successfully regulated the exercise of public power? And has it managed to protect rights, human rights, civil rights, political rights? We can ask the question another way. Is modern constitutionalism stronger today, better today, because of the written constitution? The answer is complicated. In some ways, the answer is certainly yes. Insofar as constitutionalism is rooted in the democratic values of the rule of law, the written constitution marks a giant leap forward for fairness, predictability, and notice. But in other ways, the written constitution has made it possible for political actors to do great harm to the principles of constitutionalism. The advent of the written constitution has spawned a troubling form of constitutionalism, a form of constitutionalism that threatens to become more of a cult of constitutionalism. So what can be done to protect the integrity of the written constitution? Well, come back to our discussion of different types of bills of rights. I described to you an aspirational Bill of Rights. There's an alternative model, perhaps better for the integrity of the written constitution. Some countries have what we can call a pragmatic Bill of Rights. It recognizes that the state has an important role in improving the lives of its people, but a pragmatic Bill of Rights concedes that the state may not always have the money needed to fulfill this mandate, and that the choices made in how to allocate limited public funds may be a non-justiciable matter. And so the result is that a pragmatic Bill of Rights requires a state to do what is within its capacity to move progressively toward delivering social and economic rights for all of its people, like the right to housing, to food, to health care, for example. So these rights and privileges are forward-looking directives of social policy that are intended to guide policymakers in their choices. But their choices about how to achieve the progressive realization of these social and economic rights, and about how fast to get there. These choices are ordinarily not justiciable in these pragmatic bills of rights. We see an example of a pragmatic Bill of Rights in Ireland, for example. You see, it encourages political actors to do what is possible, what is achievable, but not to overpromise and underdeliver. And I think this result is positive from the perspective of the written constitution, because it creates manageable expectations about what the state can do and how quickly it can achieve the transformative objectives of bringing social and economic security to the people. That's one way to help narrow the gulf between the Constitution as it is written and the Constitution as it is lived by the people. So this should be the goal for a written constitution, to keep the gulf as narrow as possible. The great legal theorist Lon Fuller explains that the rule of law requires a legal system to respect a number of criteria. And if you don't meet these criteria, you just don't respect the rule of law. And for Fuller, one of the key criteria for the rule of law is congruence between the rules as announced and their actual administration. In other words, the rules on the books should as much as possible match the rules in practice. What is written in the Constitution should reflect how the Constitution is applied and enforced. Otherwise, there is a discordance that leads to confusion and the possibility of arbitrary state conduct. Of course, no written constitution perfectly reflects the real political constitution. All constitutions will have this gulf that separates one from the other. But you see, the gulf risks getting larger and larger the longer a constitution lives and endures, because the longer a constitution has endured, the more it becomes interpreted, the more it becomes amended, and the more it changes in ways that are not visible to those who read the text. This brings us to something else that can be done to strengthen the integrity of the written Constitution and to ensure as much as possible that the written Constitution actually is the real Constitution. And that is to rewrite constitutions periodically. The older a constitution is, the less likely it is to reflect the values of the present generation. The U.S. Constitution is an example of this problem. It's the world's oldest written constitution. Its text protects rights and liberties in lofty and noble terms, but its text also includes language that undermines the promise of equality that it proclaims. It has gendered and racist words that have no place in any modern society. Consider the 14th Amendment. It guarantees that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And yet, the Constitution of the United States mentions still today slavery. In its reference to African Americans counting not as full persons, but as only 3/5 of a person. Or consider the 13th Amendment. It abolishes slavery, but the Fugitive Slave Clause, which requires escaped persons to be returned to their quote-unquote masters, that remains in the Constitution as a painful reminder of America's original sin. The U.S. Constitution also has outdated language on gender. Today, still today, the text tells us that men alone can be president, referring only to he or his when speaking of the presidency. Now, of course, today women can and do run for president, but imagine how school children must feel when they read their Constitution in their basic civics course. Some will be made to feel less than welcome in their own country. Others may wonder why some of their classmates are singled out for unjust, unequal treatment. But all of them will internalize that the highest law of the land creates a hierarchy of personhood. This is a problem with written constitutions that are hard to amend. Hard to amend even to do the right thing. Like in the United States, to remove references to slavery and to speak of women and men on equal terms. That's why I suggest that constitutions should be rewritten periodically in order to ensure that the text represents the current values of the time and the vision that the people have for themselves. Rewriting constitutions, you see, will help to keep as narrow as possible the inevitable gulf between the written constitution and the real, actual, lived constitution. In our time together, I've been highlighting how written constitutions have failed to live up to their promise. But I want to make one thing very clear. I believe in written constitutions, and I believe all states should have one. There are things that only written constitutional texts can do. The written word carries a profound moral force. It enshrines a tangible, touchable, readable charter of the principles that define a community and that connect disparate persons to each other, united in common cause for the betterment of themselves and their posterity. At its best, a written constitution becomes more than a place to locate the rules of law. It can become a powerful symbol of nationhood and of identity. We might think that writing a constitution would entail freezing time at the moment of the founding design, but this would be wrong. Because a properly operational written constitution offers ways to update the text, to keep it current, to allow political actors and the people to make sure that the text is congruent with their reality. And when a constitution operates correctly in this way, that constitution then becomes more than just a text. It becomes a window into the soul of the people. So it is not servitude to bind yourself to written rules. It is salvation to know what is law, what is not, and to have the power as a people to adapt the Constitution to the times and to your needs. And so Aristotle was right when he wrote long ago that the community is the Constitution. A written constitution, a truly written constitution, a fully written constitution is an impossibility. And it always will be impossible because no constitution can ever completely be written. Yet the written constitution is, in my mind, the greatest advancement in modern government, perhaps in the history of democracy. And we must honor that legacy by striving always to keep the constitutional text aligned with the values and needs of the people for whom the Constitution was written. Happy World Constitution Day 2021. Congratulations to all of you celebrating in your own jurisdictions. Let us honor and respect and continue to learn about constitutions wherever we may be. Happy World Constitution Day.